In this presentation, we'll take a look at age banding methodology, another way to plan for retirement needs. And this methodology is by Dr. Basu. Here's the article that you'll be reading this week. Age banding, a model for planning retirement needs. And you'll access this directly from within your week 1 classroom. This paper explains the entire methodology with examples, and in this short presentation what I would like to do is give you a preview, walk through this concept, and I think in combination you'll really grasp a very important tool that you can add to your tool belt when it comes to helping your clients project retirement contributions. In a previous presentation we explored the traditional funding method, and then in which you are looking at one retirement period, constant expenses throughout that retirement period, and then one asset allocation. And you recall back to the funding ideas there, right? So every year there would be a constant contribution, or perhaps even a serial contribution, right? We'd look at the fixed contribution, serial contributions. But again, that entire concept is one retirement period, constant expenses, one asset allocation. In this discussion, we'll take a look at age banding. Age banding is the idea that, retirement is not one uniform period. This is consistent with a concept that I learned from my mentor in the business, Michael Stein, in which he looked at retirement being 3 periods. A very active period when actually expenses can be higher than the pre-retirement time. A time where now you get more into being at home, being active, but doing things, and then finally into that final phase, which is often dominated by healthcare concerns. And so the expenses for living expenses, entertainment, healthcare, and taxes can be very different in each of those different segments, or as Dr. Basu refers to, as those different types of bands. And if we in fact are planning for different bands, then we can set up multiple investment portfolios with different asset allocations. Why? Because there's different time horizons. So let's take a look at that in some more detail. So here you can see that the paper will describe 3 bands. The first decade starting at retirement, assuming that retirement at the end of 65, so you have a decade there, a decade after that where again it's at home, less travel, and then that final decade focused on healthcare, just as I had described a couple moments ago. What are the implications? Well, the expenses change. There's different growth rates in inflation for what we might expect taxes to be versus healthcare costs versus fixed expenses. And so that as you run those numbers, they can be very different on the growth rates. Also, as just explained, because we can start to plan for different investment horizons, that can have implications on your client's risk tolerance. Very different risk tolerance when you're looking at a time horizon of 10 years versus 30 years. Here's one of the tables that you'll be looking at within the paper. And you can see the age banding alternative view table 1, taxes, costs at age 60, the 5-year growth rate. So you're looking at what are those costs at age 65. They're described in that right-hand column. Okay? You'll be taking a look at that. The traditional view from below would be one lump sum cost needed for, in 1 year, projected at a 3% growth rate. So you're looking at $86,000. Notice that the age banding, as you start to really dig down in and really apply some growth rates which reflect more of the reality, where healthcare and leisure costs may go up much more than the cost of inflation, that changes things. So in the beginning, we're looking at expenses in the age banding, which can actually be higher than we might be projecting in the traditional. By projecting higher expenses, we as planners are more conservative, right? We're going to try to plan for higher projected needs. As you move through the bands, Table 3 in the reading starts to adjust those projections that you'll be looking at every year inflating by the inflation rate, realizing that as we move through those different phases, very active to more at home but still somewhat active to now moving into healthcare, the life cycle factors as described in this paper change. Let's just take a look at healthcare. So we're going to notice how that increases quite a bit. So those healthcare costs that we project at age 66, or throughout that decade, we could say, would then be inflated at the start of the next decade. And those costs through that band would be inflated in the last one simply because we project that they're going to increase, and certainly that is going to increase. But over and above, then you have the inflation rate on top of that. But look at leisure. Here you're saying, well, our leisure expenses right now, projected at age 65, would be X, but expecting that in that active retirement period, leisure expenses will actually jump in that first decade. You're going to inflate that age 65 expense projection to 1.5. At the end of that decade, then reducing that projection by 50%. These numbers obviously are not set in stone, but the idea is logical. We're projecting today's expenses to day one of retirement. Then we start to adjust those based on these life cycle factors. Throughout the period, we're applying a growth rate, which may be very different than just one constant, and then at the end of the band, we start to reset. As you read the article, I hope that this becomes even more clearer for you. And so, what are the implications of age banding? Well, first of all, we may project higher retirement expenses, particularly in those beginning years, because we're adjusting some of those factors higher. We're using higher growth rates. But notice, compared to the traditional, as you move out, there's differences there too in the expense comparisons. Again, a factor of what are those factor adjustments for each of the categories, what are the growth rates. Now that we know our projected retirement income years annually, and we add those up by the line items, right, of those different categories, now let's shift over to the mindset of retirement investment portfolios. And in this image I pulled together, what I wanted to do is give you a visual of what this concept of age banding is all about. The first band is taking care of those needs age 66 to 75, that first decade, first 10 years. So we're looking at a period in which our investment time period, our pre-retirement contributions, is in that first green bar. If you want to be even more conservative in your planning for the clients, you could get into a safety net where during that first green bar we have an allocation which meets that time horizon and is appropriate for the client's risk tolerance. But realizing that as you get closer to that start of retirement, you'll need to move from more of a growth to a fixed income or more conservative portfolio, you can in fact put that in. And as you read the article, you'll get into the idea that we not only move from it, we're set up a investment allocation for band 1, but as we get closer, we start to shift that more conservative, sort of like we do for college planning, right? In the early years of college planning, we can be very aggressive, looking for growth, but as the child starts getting into high school, we start shifting to a more conservative mix, and by the time they enter college, then in fact it may be into cash equivalent funds. That's very consistent with life cycle investing, right? Where the asset allocation shifts the closer you get towards retirement. The same concept is applying here. But notice bands 2 and 3. The same basic idea applies. You're going to have that growth portfolio or that asset allocation, which is appropriate for the client's risk tolerance and time horizon, in place up to that safety amount, and then gets into a very conservative or fixed income orientation so that you can have those systematic annual withdrawals. But notice that the green band in 2 and 3 is much longer. And if that is hitting projections and things are going as we would anticipate over a longer period of time, compounding kicks in. So we can effectively achieve a lot of wonderful successes here. And in this slide, I tried to sum up some of those. Each band is invested more aggressive mix prior to that safety window. And you can see the longer the time horizon, perhaps the more aggressive. So now you may be earning 6% in that first band, but then 8% and 10%. And the compounding effect can be tremendous. The idea of the safety cushion that I mentioned to you, whether or not you bring that in, whether it's 5 years, whether it's 2 years, and as you move into the band, you move to that of a more conservative fixed income, cash flows being thrown off so that the client can use that for their living expenses. Here's table 6, table 7. As you move through that reading, age banding methodology yields greater investment accumulation, and because you are accumulating more, because of that investment strategy, you'll actually be able to present to the client the idea that they actually will need to make lower annual contributions. Why? Because those lower contributions will have a greater compounding effect than when we're looking at maybe a lower overall, a lower asset allocation, because you're only planning out to age 65 versus 75 and 85. Do you see the value here? So why would you consider age banding over level or serial? Or why might you present that to a client? Well, it gives you one other leading edge methodology that can help to differentiate you. And let me tell you a quick story. So, a few years ago, I was teaching Business 593, and during my class, I would have students work through an age banding and actually calculate all this on a spreadsheet. It was a lot of work, but I really thought it was valuable, and that was part of my class. Well, we did that in teams. About a week or two after that completion of the project, one of the students came back into the class, and she shared a story in our live chat, and she said, I presented this to a client, a potential client. This client was looking at 2 other possible financial planners. And she presented the idea along with level and serial payments of age banding and how that would work. The client came back and gave her an $11 million account. And she asked that prospect or that new client, why did you choose me? And the client said, because you were talking about something that the other 2 planners did not even mention. What a powerful story. You could feel everyone in the chat just sit up and listen to that. And that's why I encourage you to consider age banding as an alternative. What's the benefit to your client? Well, in this, you're actually projecting higher retirement needs. And that's an element of conservatism. That's something we strive for, right? To make sure that our clients are not going to run out of money because we just underestimated that need. You are funding those needs through prudent allocations that really reflect different time horizons. And because there's different time horizons and different assumptions in there, you're able to really entertain different risk tolerances, which flow over into different asset allocations which are appropriate for the client's risk tolerance, their time horizons, their preferences, and their constraints. So in this short presentation, what I try to do is give you an overview of that paper you'll be reading. It is very worthwhile, and I encourage you to go through that and also discuss this in class.